Finally, we've got someone that could be a little bit more informative than the Moscow Police Department. Check this interview out.
On live now from Fox. It's been 2 weeks since 4 University of Idaho students were found stabbed to death in their rooms. While police and federal agents have said they are following up on hundreds of leads, no suspects have been named, and there are still so many questions. I do want to bring in Joseph Scott Morgan. He is a forensics professor at Jacksonville State University and does have a hit podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us. We appreciate it.
Hey, good morning, Joshua. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, first off, your thoughts on this case that so many people are paying so close attention to.
Well, I think the first term that comes to mind is complex, and just the sheer volume of physical evidence that's going to be found at the scene could be quite daunting for all of those involved. The biological evidence, specifically as it's related to blood evidence, and of course from that springs DNA, and so it will make matters very difficult to weed through. The trick is how well are you planned in advance for an event like this, and what resources do you have at your disposal? The rub is, however, when you're talking about a smaller jurisdiction, they're not used to handling a case of this magnitude. It's not a knock against them. That's the reality of it. It's rural America, and they don't deal with quadruple knife-related or sharp force injury-related homicides. Not many people do, actually. This is kind of an outlier statistically.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of the questions come into play, because you don't have that many quadruple homicides that are happening in Idaho, let alone in Moscow, Idaho, involving 4 university students that are murdered there. From a forensics perspective, what might make this case a little bit more difficult or different than other murder cases?
Well, one of the things, going back to this idea of biological evidence, is what we refer to as co-mingling of the sample, where, they've talked at length, and you've heard a variety of different things stated relative to the weapon of choice. Hunting knife, somebody used the term Rambo knife, military style knife. Either way, if it is the same weapon, just imagine, if you will, where you have 4 victims and the same weapon is being used over and over. The first victim that you have will kind of be the standalone, where you will not have DNA from the others. But if the same weapon is being utilized, and this is just the weapon, we're not talking about DNA that the perpetrator may have left behind or anything like that. You're moving from victim to victim to victim to victim. And when this happens, there's a commingling of DNA. And so to try to unspool that and in the lab is difficult. And I just hope that nothing has been compromised at the scene. I don't have any reason to believe that it has. But just that alone makes this complex. Not to mention the fact this house has been identified on several occasions as a location where people gather. So you've got this big collective of people that kind of come in, they hang out. Let's face it, everybody in college, might have had an off-campus location they went to and, met with their friends and that sort of thing. So those individuals that have inhabited that space, whether it's in just kind of a superficial way or maybe a more intimate way, have left some essence of their self behind. When you talk about things like touch DNA, which comes about as a result of sloughing dead skin cells. We slough thousands of these things every day, and so you get a partial strand from that. The really rich DNA that you're looking for is going to come from blood evidence. And in my experience, I worked for the coroner in New Orleans and for the ME in Atlanta for many, many years. And one of the things that happens every now and then with sharp force injuries, particularly where it's a frenzied event and they're talking about multiple stab wounds, is that the perpetrator will actually injure themselves. Might not even be aware of it at the time because they're in such a heightened state. And if that happens, now you've got the perpetrator's DNA commingled in there as well.
And it does sound like there were people coming in and out of there, not just in general, but maybe over the hours after the killings actually happened. Could that have contaminated anything at the scene? I know that's kind of a general question that you necessarily can't speak to as far as this specific case, but overall, could that have tampered with anything?
Well, yeah, anytime you introduce another person into this environment, they're bringing along with them their DNA. And just to wax kind of academic for a second, we have to understand, kind of our godfather within forensics is a gentleman named Edmond Lacard, and he came up with something called his contact theory. And it basically states that every contact leaves a trace. Now, he came up with that over 100 years ago. It's pretty fascinating when you think about it nowadays. But he understood even at that point in time, before we had DNA technology, that every time an individual introduces himself into what we would consider to be a pristine scene, they're bringing something with them. Even if it's the police officers, you might have mud on your shoes. You might have some other trace evidence that's coming from your car, even maybe a fiber from the seat of your car or from your home that you introduce in there. So you've got kind of all of these issues that when you start to look at it from a mathematical perspective, it kind of builds out like that exponentially, and it's something that you have to factor into everything that you do, and that's what they're doing right now. It does not surprise me, Joshua, that it's taking them this long. I think that they're being very careful. They've got fantastic resources at their disposal with just the folks at the FBI lab, not to mention the people with the Idaho State Police as well.
Why do you think so many people across the country are paying such close attention to this case? It is high profile now, and I mean, there's articles released about it pretty much on an hourly basis. People are talking about it on social media a lot. Why might that be?
It's the stuff of nightmares. And I think that, when you begin to think that you're sending your child off to college, and then suddenly you have this mysterious perpetrator that comes through the door and wipes out, certainly 3 of the 6 people that are permanently domiciled there, three of the 5 that are permanently domiciled there, and then you've got this one young man who happened to be there as well. It is the stuff of nightmares, and that, I think, from my experience with true crime, that's one of the things that fascinates people, because this is not something that happens necessarily in a vacuum. It's something that, many people, particularly those that have kids, can identify with, and they're thinking, is my child safe wherever they are? And the fact that no one has been caught, it's, when you look at the pool of potential suspects, this is not a big metropolis, right? People know one another up there. And so you begin to think, do we know this individual that has perpetrated something that is so markedly horrific? If, I think we've heard little snips of this along the way relative to the police, and some of the other people there. I think even the prosecutor, as he's famously walking down the street, he's given this interview kind of over his shoulder, corner. They talked about the level of violence that was there. And, I got to be honest, I was kind of taken back by the fact that they had released that information, that we had that much information, but we do know the scene is quite ghastly. So I think that that kind of captures the imagination of the people out there that are following this case and cases that are similar to it, Joshua.
In your opinion, any mess-ups here, any problems that investigators might have caused in this case? Because as you mentioned, they're not necessarily used to dealing with such a high-profile case in Moscow, Idaho. Have you seen anything that stuck out to you?
There was something that was mentioned along the way that, kind of piqued my interest, I think, as a former medical legal death investigator, which means, you work for the medical examiner and the coroner. You're the eyes and the ears of the medical examiner out in the field. For me, what it was I think that the coroner was not allowed access to the body for some time. That's not an uncommon practice. where the problem is this. One of the things that we try to do at scenes when it comes to the examination of remains is to begin the measurement of what's referred to as the postmortem interval. So, and that's things like that everybody's heard of, like rigor mortis, okay? And then there's some other things like postmortem lividity, which is the settling of blood, and algor mortis, which is another term for the cooling that takes place after death. And we have these kind of measured scientific benchmarks that we look at, depending upon the environmental conditions that you're in. You have to examine the body within that. And so the further down the timeline you move, you lose that data. And one of the key things here, Joshua, is the fact that timeline is an issue, isn't it? They want to try to understand. So, we can judge things like the rigidity of human remain. To what degree has fixation began in the joints relative to rigor mortis and settling of blood. And so any delay in the time that the coroner may have had to get there and examine those elements could be problematic. Of course, we don't fully understand what type of trace evidence she would have encountered making her way to the body. So they have to do this balancing act. Is it worth it to have the evidence, the physical evidence, compromised because of the position of the body to allow her to do this, or is it better that we just allow her to get to it after we've collected everything that we possibly can? Again, back to Lacards, every contact leaves a trace, and so that can certainly be an issue as well.
All right, Joseph Scott Morgan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Anything else that you want to make sure to mention before we let you go?
I think I plead with everybody to please be patient with these folks out there. They're doing everything that they can at this moment in time, and it's important that you just take a step back and understand they're under the gun. They're aware that they're under the gun. At least their managers are. I hope that that doesn't make it down to the rank and file officer or agent that's processing this, that they can kind of shut all of that out, really remain focused on what they have to do. They don't need any further outstanding distractions and that sort of thing, because the more their little world is compromised in this violence that has taken place, it's going to impede their ability to move this case forward and try to identify who did this and get them off the streets.
And before I let you go, do you think they do already have a suspect or suspects in mind and probably know who did this?
I have no way of knowing. I would hope that they would have gone through, and I would imagine they would have, say for instance, like the CODIS database, locally, just to identify anybody that might be in that environment that might be identified as a predator. If they have that already ramped up, if they find an unknown DNA sample, they can plug that into the database and see if they come back with a hit. And not to mention, it's good old-fashioned shoe leather on the part of the investigators, where they're going door to door. And one of the problems that are, as a college professor, I can speak to this. One of the problems that arises is, and this is quite striking, is the fact that, remember, as this horrific slaughter took place, the kids had already been eyeballing, the students had already been eyeballing Thanksgiving vacation coming up. They already had plans to leave. So unlike a regular population, where people are kind of seated in that location, they live there and that sort of thing, that's not what the university is like. It's kind of transient. So you've already got people that are looking to get back home. Well, this stimulus is added to that, is factored in. And now, even by the admission of the president, when he gave one of his comments, he said, look, I know people are scared. Some people might not come back. We're going to go ahead and set things up for online classes, and that's all fine and good. But here's the problem. Even if you are a peripheral player in this, that you didn't directly know these individuals that were slaughtered, you might have some kind of knowledge, something that you heard something that you saw, that if the police were eye to eye with you and they were communicating with you, they could elicit that information from you, and it would go to painting a better picture, a better picture. Now you've got kids that are scared. Some might not come back. Well, you don't know if therein lies the key. There was also, I think, and this has to be factored in as well, there was an opportunity for potentially the perpetrator to have slipped out of town as well, because you've got this kind of mass exodus. If we are to believe what we've heard, I've heard the term ghost town used a lot, and generally over Thanksgiving vacation is a time when that happens. Nobody wants to be there any longer. They have to be. They want to get back to their family. The trick is, we're back in session now. How many kids have come back? Is there a noticeable, number that have kind of chosen not to? And the police are going to have, kind of their work level is going to be amped up, because they're going to have to reach out to those people that chose not to come back. And also, we're so far down the road now, over 2 weeks, memories go cold. Even that short period of time, things that might have been fresh at that moment in time aren't so fresh now.
All right, Joseph Scott Morgan, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. You have a good day.
Well, no clues, but at least we did get someone up there who's a little bit more informative. He did give me food for thought, some things that I could ponder on now, and I'm a little bit more convinced that they may be able to make a break into the